What do you say to the people who say, Sophie Cunningham, she shoots those three-pointers, makes them look like free throws?
I'm like, good. That's what I get paid to do. I should.
You do get paid.
Barely, but we're still surviving.
You're a free agent right now.
The basketball world genuinely thought the Indiana Fever had finally figured it all out and assumed that after a totally grueling season defined by record-breaking viewership, immense national scrutiny and unbelievable internal stress, the front office was finally ready to build a completely stable, unstoppable empire around their golden goose. But behind closed doors, a massive, unprecedented storm is brewing that actively threatens to completely tear the entire franchise apart from the inside out before their dynasty even truly begins. When management abruptly fired head coach Christy Sides, fans across the country threw an absolute celebration, genuinely thinking the exhausting era of highly questionable rotations, bizarre late-game execution, and totally confusing offensive schemes was finally dead and buried. Assuming the path was completely cleared for a brilliant, modern coaching staff that would finally let the players run wild, push the pace, and absolutely dominate the league. The front office confidently promised a massive culture shift, a bold new direction, and a highly innovative system specifically designed to elevate their young, electric superstars to legitimate championship status. But what the executives conveniently refused to tell anyone was that their grand, highly secretive master plan involved bringing in a voice that would completely disrupt the established locker room chemistry and spark a massive, undeniable wave of internal pushback from the players themselves. Whispers and intense rumors began circulating almost immediately that the front office was heavily scrambling, completely disorganized, and making massive franchise-altering decisions without ever actually bothering to consult the franchise players who are the ones actually forced to step onto the hardwood and put their bodies on the line every single night. The mainstream sports media aggressively portrayed the coaching change as a simple, highly logical upgrade, a necessary step forward for a maturing roster that just needed a bit more discipline. But the actual reality painted by league insiders is a terrifying, highly volatile portrait of a franchise in absolute, unmitigated chaos with star players allegedly feeling totally blindsided, completely ignored, and pushed to their absolute breaking point by a group of executives who seem completely out of touch with the reality of the modern game. For a brief, fleeting moment, it actually seemed like peace and stability might finally settle over Indianapolis. But that comforting illusion was completely shattered into a million pieces the exact second the front office began leaking their true intentions to the press. And what happened next would immediately trigger a massive domino effect of deep frustration, leaked rumors, and alleged locker room ultimatums that absolutely no one in the basketball world saw coming. The exact instant Stephanie White's name was officially attached to the Indiana Fever coaching vacancy, the entire atmosphere inside the practice facility completely shifted from hopeful, exciting anticipation to a heavy, totally suffocating anxiety because absolutely anyone who knows recent WNBA history knows exactly what kind of fiercely rigid, uncompromising ship she runs. White is an undeniable basketball legend, a beloved former Fever player who deeply understands the intense pressure of the city and the high expectations of the fan base. And she most recently led the Connecticut Sun with a gritty, hard-nosed, old-school mentality that demands total perfection and absolute, unquestioning submission to her complex defensive systems. But there is a massive, glaring, completely unavoidable problem that the front office executives somehow chose to completely ignore when making this heavily publicized hire, which is the undeniable objective fact that her rigidly structured, slow-paced, half-court, grinded-out system is the exact opposite of what this young, highly explosive Indiana roster was actually built to do. White built her formidable coaching reputation on grueling perimeter defense, meticulous, time-consuming play calling, and a tightly controlled sideline environment where players are strictly expected to be highly disciplined soldiers executing orders rather than wildly creative artists allowed to improvise, a coaching philosophy that completely and utterly suffocates the modern run-and-gun, high-octane style that the new generation of basketball players thrives on. Players all around the league know for a fact that playing for White means dealing with an intense, totally unforgiving daily microscope where every single defensive rotation mistake is heavily highlighted in film sessions. Every rogue or early clock shot is heavily criticized, and individual offensive freedom is entirely sacrificed for the sake of the collective defensive scheme. For a veteran-heavy, battle-tested team desperately trying to grind out ugly, low-scoring playoff wins in the trenches, that strategy might actually work flawlessly. But for a roster completely overflowing with young, hyper-athletic, high-octane offensive talent, placing that kind of heavy, incredibly restrictive leash on them is an absolute recipe for a total locker room disaster. The front office somehow genuinely believed that bringing in a familiar, nostalgic face with a tough love approach would magically and instantly fix their lingering defensive issues and forcefully compel the young core to mature overnight, completely blind to the obvious reality that modern, highly paid, wildly popular superstars absolutely do not respond well to being treated like disposable chess pieces on a rigid tactical board. The locker room was reportedly left absolutely stunned by the impending decision, realizing almost instantly that the free-flowing, high-scoring, wildly entertaining identity they desperately wanted to establish was about to be forcibly replaced by grueling, exhausting defensive drills and a painfully slow, completely heavily micromanaged defensive tempo. It became blatantly, painfully obvious to everyone paying attention that management was aggressively trying to force a square peg into a round hole, weirdly prioritizing franchise nostalgia and old-school grit over actual, tangible stylistic compatibility on the court, ultimately setting the stage for a massive, highly destructive ideological war between the new coaching staff and the star players. But if the management team actually thought the roster was just going to blindly, quietly accept this massive culture shock and fall into line without putting up a massive fight, they were completely dead wrong. Because the intense pushback was about to start at the very top of the food chain. Caitlin Clark did not just simply survive her highly publicized rookie season. She endured an absolute, unrelenting physical and mental gauntlet that pushed her to the very edge of her absolute limits, taking a massive physical beating that would have completely shattered the confidence of most seasoned veterans. From the very moment she stepped onto the professional court for her debut, she was aggressively targeted, violently shoved, heavily bruised, and relentlessly hunted by opposing defenders who desperately wanted to welcome her to the big leagues with relentless, borderline dangerous physicality, ultimately leaving her entirely exhausted and desperately in need of a coaching system that would actually protect her and properly highlight her generational, unprecedented talent. During her historic time at Iowa, she massively thrived in a system heavily built on total, unquestioned offensive freedom, a lightning-fast transition pace, and a head coach who explicitly trusted her to accurately read the floor, make brilliant split-second decisions, and confidently pull up for a shot from the midcourt logo without any hesitation or lingering fear of being immediately benched for a bad decision. But playing under Christie's sides, she was often seen looking visibly, intensely frustrated by highly clunky play calling, totally predictable half-court sets, and a complete lack of proper floor spacing, leading absolutely everyone to confidently believe the next head coaching hire would undoubtedly be a modern offensive mastermind solely dedicated to unlocking her full, unrestricted, explosive potential. Instead, the front office seemingly handed the keys to the franchise to a coach deeply notorious for heavily structured, highly grinding, low-scoring half-court basketball, completely ignoring the blatant fact that Clark's greatest, most undeniable superpower is her rare ability to operate brilliantly in chaos, aggressively push the game's tempo, and completely break down opposing defenses in fast break transition before they can even manage to properly set up their half-court assignments. Intense rumors immediately began flying across social media and league circles that Clark and her tight-knit camp were heavily, deeply frustrated by the bizarre direction the franchise was taking, allegedly feeling that the front office executives were completely and utterly failing to surround her with the right supportive environment, the right fast-paced system, and the right coaching mentality absolutely required to maximize her historic, league-altering skill set. She didn't just want a brand new head coach. She desperately wanted a collaborative partner, someone who fundamentally understood that the future of the WNBA is incredibly fast, highly explosive, and inherently creative, not heavily bogged down by outdated, old-school mentalities that wrongly treat offensive flair and deep three-point shooting as a defensive liability. The growing whispers of her deep dissatisfaction sent absolute shockwaves through the entire league because a disgruntled, highly unhappy franchise player with a massive, absolutely undeniable global platform is an executive's absolute worst nightmare, especially when that specific player is almost single-handedly responsible for the team's massive, unprecedented financial boom, skyrocketing merchandise sales, and constantly sold-out arenas across the entire country. Clark has always been known as a fiercely loyal competitor who wants to win basketball games more than absolutely anything else in the world. But she also fully knows her immense worth and the terrifying idea of spending her highly anticipated sophomore season completely trapped in a slow, suffocating, heavily restricted system under a micromanaging authority figure is something she was allegedly completely unwilling to just quietly accept. But the shocking truth was that she wasn't the only one looking at this massive, highly questionable coaching shift with deep, profound skepticism because the escalating drama was about to aggressively pull in one of the most explosive, highly controversial. The Indiana Fever currently have a massive, glaring, undeniably massive problem that absolutely everyone in the basketball world can clearly see, which is their desperate, immediate, highly urgent need for a legitimate enforcer. A tough, gritty player who will step up, aggressively talk trash, and physically protect their star point guard from the relentless, punishing, cheap shots and incredibly hard fouls that entirely defined her rookie season. For several agonizing months, intense, non-stop trade rumors and massive free agency speculations have heavily linked the Indiana Fever front office to Phoenix Mercury star Sophie Cunningham, a highly talented player completely infamous for her incredibly fiery temper, totally unapologetic attitude, and absolute, undeniable refusal to ever back down from anyone anywhere, at any time on the basketball court. Cunningham is the exact, specific type of player the Indiana roster so desperately needs right now. Someone who instantly brings a gritty, highly intimidating physical edge to a quiet locker room. Someone who will aggressively and immediately get in the face of any opponent who even tries to lay a heavy hand on Clark. And someone who actually heavily thrives in the chaotic, high-emotion, incredibly tense moments that usually totally overwhelm younger, more inexperienced teams. The Indiana fan base was completely and utterly obsessed with the highly appealing idea of adding Cunningham's lethal, highly accurate three-point shooting and absolutely ruthless perimeter defense to the current roster, viewing her as the absolute perfect missing piece required to finally transform the team from a highly talented group of unproven youngsters into a legitimately terrifying, unstoppable championship powerhouse. But there is a massive, highly complicated catch to the entire Sophie Cunningham equation that makes this potential team-up incredibly explosive and highly volatile, which is her highly documented, long-standing history of openly clashing with rigid, uncompromising authority figures and her deep-seated, absolute hatred for being heavily micromanaged or strictly told to tone down her aggressive, highly emotional personality. She plays the game of basketball with pure, completely unbridled emotion, constantly feeding off the wild energy of the home crowd and the intense pressure of the moment, requiring a coach who will essentially let her off the leash and completely allow her to just be the fierce enforcer she naturally is without constantly pulling her aside during timeouts to heavily criticize her bold attitude or her highly aggressive shot selection. The very idea of Cunningham willingly joining a team fully commanded by Stephanie White is conceptually disastrous on almost every single level because White's intense demand for absolute unwavering discipline and strict unquestioning adherence to a highly systematic, rigid game plan completely contradicts absolutely everything that makes Cunningham such a dangerous, wildly effective, and highly popular player on the hardwood. Rumors rapidly exploded that if Cunningham were to ever seriously consider signing a contract with Indiana, the looming presence of a highly strict, old-school, no-nonsense coach would be an absolute, undeniable deal-breaker for her. As she allegedly has absolutely zero interest in spending the absolute prime years of her highly successful career battling a head coach who actively wants to suppress her natural fire and force her into a boring, highly structured, completely robotic role. This incredibly complicated situation immediately created a massive, highly tense standoff behind the scenes with the front office desperately wanting and heavily needing Cunningham's rare toughness while simultaneously moving to hire a head coach whose very foundational philosophy would actively and aggressively repel the exact type of free-spirited, fiercely independent enforcer they so desperately need to properly protect their young franchise player. The deeper this entire situation spiraled, the more obvious it became that the Indiana Fever were no longer simply managing a basketball team. They were trying to control a media phenomenon that had completely outgrown the traditional structure of the WNBA. Every move now carried enormous pressure. Every decision was instantly dissected by fans, analysts, former players, podcasts, and national television personalities desperately trying to understand whether Indiana was actually building a future dynasty or unknowingly creating one of the biggest internal collapses professional basketball had ever seen. That pressure intensified dramatically once league insiders began quietly questioning whether the front office truly understood the kind of roster they had assembled. Because on paper, the Fever looked like the perfect modern basketball machine. They had star power, elite shooting potential, transition speed, youth, charisma, and unmatched national attention. But basketball talent alone does not guarantee chemistry, and chemistry becomes incredibly fragile once players begin feeling like the organization is forcing them into identities they never wanted. The growing concern inside league circles was not necessarily that Stephanie White would fail as a basketball coach. The concern was that her philosophy might fundamentally clash with the emotional DNA of the roster itself. Indiana's young core wanted to play with confidence, pace, and freedom. White built her reputation on discipline, structure, and defensive accountability. Those worlds do not always peacefully coexist. And the terrifying part for the organization was that everybody could already sense the tension before the season even truly started. Fans began analyzing every interview for hidden frustration. Social media exploded with theories every time a player used vague language about adjustments or new systems. Former players openly debated whether Indiana was making a catastrophic mistake by potentially slowing down the most electrifying offensive superstar women's basketball had ever produced. Caitlin Clark's rookie season had already proven one undeniable truth to the entire sports world. She is not just another talented young player trying to develop slowly over time. She is an entertainment force. The moment she crosses half court, fans expect something explosive to happen. They expect logo threes. They expect impossible passes. They expect chaos. They expect speed. They expect creativity. That expectation changes how teams must build around her. You cannot market a player as a revolutionary offensive weapon while simultaneously placing her inside a system that minimizes spontaneity. The fans would immediately notice. The media would immediately criticize it. Most importantly, Clark herself would absolutely feel the restriction. That is why the rumors surrounding her frustration carried so much weight. According to whispers around the league, people close to Clark were allegedly becoming increasingly concerned that Indiana's front office was focusing too heavily on controlling the roster instead of empowering it. They feared the organization was overreacting to last season's defensive struggles by moving too far toward rigid structure instead of simply refining the explosive style that made the team dangerous in the first place. And honestly, from a basketball perspective, the concern made complete sense. The Fever were never going to become successful by trying to imitate slow, grinding veteran teams built around half-court execution. That is not their identity. Their greatest advantage is speed, unpredictability, spacing, and offensive pressure. Their roster is designed to attack before defenses get comfortable. That is exactly why the possible addition of Sophie Cunningham became such a fascinating and complicated storyline. Cunningham represents intensity in its purest form. She plays every possession like it personally offended her. She embraces confrontation. She welcomes hostility. She thrives in emotional environments where other players become uncomfortable. Indiana desperately needed some of that edge. Throughout Caitlin Clark's rookie season, there were countless moments where the Fever looked emotionally overwhelmed by physical teams. Opponents constantly tested them. Defenders aggressively bumped Clark off screens, trapped her full court, and challenged her toughness every single night. Sometimes Indiana responded well. Other times they looked completely unprepared for the level of physical aggression being thrown at them. That is where Cunningham's appeal became impossible to ignore. She would instantly give Indiana a personality shift. She would give them someone willing to fight back. Someone willing to absorb the emotional pressure of hostile environments. Someone who would never allow opponents to bully the roster physically or mentally. Or were they trying to become the most entertaining offensive force in basketball? Trying to accomplish both at the same time sounds ideal in theory. In reality, balancing those philosophies can become extremely difficult, especially when young stars are still discovering who they are as professionals. That is why some people around the league quietly feared the Fever were trying to rush the process too aggressively. Instead of allowing the roster to naturally evolve around Clark's unique brilliance, management appeared determined to immediately force championship-level structure onto a team still emotionally learning how to handle national pressure. And that pressure was unlike anything the WNBA had ever experienced before. Every Fever road game felt like a playoff atmosphere. Opposing arenas sold out weeks in advance. Television ratings exploded anytime Clark played. Fans traveled across the country just to watch warm-ups. Cameras followed her constantly. Sports debate shows discussed her daily. No young player in league history had ever entered professional basketball under that kind of spotlight, which made the internal stability of the organization even more important. Because once external attention becomes overwhelming, players desperately need trust internally. They need communication. They need clarity. They need to feel like the organization understands them. And according to the growing rumors surrounding the Fever, that trust was beginning to fracture. Some reports suggested players were frustrated by how little consultation occurred regarding major organizational decisions. Others hinted that certain members of the roster felt management cared more about public perception than actual stylistic compatibility. Whether those rumors were completely true almost stopped mattering. Because perception itself had already become part of the problem. The moment fans start believing dysfunction exists, every small disagreement suddenly looks enormous. Every emotional timeout becomes evidence. Every awkward press conference becomes controversy. Every frustrated facial expression becomes national discussion material. And the Indiana Fever were operating under a microscope bigger than anything the WNBA had ever seen. That microscope only became more intense once analysts started discussing the possibility of long-term dissatisfaction from Clark herself. Now, to be completely